What I'm going to talk about is some thoughts about how we can use partnership and collaboration within the industry to accelerate the delivery of the digital railway and potentially even move on to the next generation of technology. So I'm going to talk about, amongst other things, a concept called innovation partnerships. If I may, just a couple of slides just to introduce the Railway Industry Association to you. I'm sure many of you will know, but just for the sake of completeness, what are we? We're the trade association for the supply chain. We represent and promote the supply chain to industry and government. And we pretty much, our members cover pretty much every aspect of the railway industry. And one thing that's not particularly well understood is about 60% of our members are SMEs. But under the subject of the day, innovation for a digital railway. So innovation, in my view, is not just about technology. It's just as likely to be about people or process. Technology is often only just the enabler. So my question really is, how do we innovate to maintain the railway's competitive edge? Because you don't innovate, or I suggest you shouldn't innovate for the sake of innovation. You're innovating to improve your business. So what's the challenges for introducing the next generation of complex safety-critical technology into the railway? And if we're thinking about digital railway, whichever country is successful in delivering the first digital ETCS level 2 or 3 mixed traffic railway has got an exportable world first. And how can we make that happen in the UK? So as I said, you probably shouldn't just start from the technology. I think you need to think about some other things. What is the problem you're trying to solve? What's the challenge? Or in the language we increasingly talk about, what's the output specification? What is it you want to achieve? You know, it might be in terms of trains per hour capacity, it might be in terms of performance, it might be in terms of customer satisfaction. It's probably in terms of all of those things. You then have to think about where are you going to find a solution, because this is perhaps something, if it's truly innovative, by definition it's not been done before, so you're probably not looking in the usual places. There's not necessarily a solution already on the market. And then, and I'm thinking here about our clients, and this is often the sticking point, is how are we going to procure the solution? Because we tend in the Western world to procure on the basis of, I want low risk, so that probably means I want proven technology, and very often we're procuring against a detailed specification, and often it's all about lowest price compliant bid. Now all of those things can be appropriate if you want to buy yesterday's outputs. If you want something that's truly transformational and it's not already available on the market, those sort of approaches are probably not appropriate. So what I'm going to talk about is at least one model for how you might procure that kind of complex technology. So if we think of, first of all, about the customer need, what's the problem we're trying to solve? I think you've got to think about the ultimate customer, so be it passenger or freight customers in the railway context, and then the immediate customer, so it might be the train operators and the infrastructure manager. But also we shouldn't forget the competition. The railway doesn't exist in a bubble. We are not owed a living. We can look to other sectors and see the rate of innovation in other sectors, and we have to be able to keep pace with those and offer something to our customers that is comparable and preferably better than those other offers. So for the railway, and a digital railway in particular, what might be some of the challenges? And I've already touched on some of them before. You might think about increasing capacity, performance, connectivity, better customer experience, reducing cost. Yeah, there's no point doing the next generation of signaling solution if the overall cost of ownership, if the economic proposition is greater than what you've already got. And what we're able to increasingly put into railway business cases is the wider economic benefit. What's it doing for beyond the railway fence? What's it doing to create jobs and employment for users of the railway? And what we'd really like to see is the question being asked, what's it doing to create jobs and employment for railway suppliers? And all of that can lead to an output specification rather than a very detailed input specification. I was saying yesterday, somebody asked me the question, where is there an example of an output specification being used? And actually there is one out there, at least one, and it's a railway example, and it's Thameslink, where the conventional wisdom with Thameslink would have been that the maximum capacity you could get through that central tunnel with conventional signalling was 16, maybe 18 trains an hour, and the government understood that that didn't make their business case work. To make the business case work, they needed 24 trains per hour. And again, conventional wisdom would have said, oh, well, we don't do it like that round here. We've never done that before. That's too high risk. We can't possibly put that in our detailed input specification. So what they did was they looked around and they realized that actually this was not a moonshot. It was conceivable that the industry could deliver 24 trains an hour. It hadn't been done before, but it was not inconceivable. So instead of going for a detailed input specification and proven technology, they structured the procurement around buying 24 trains an hour. And hopefully next year, that's exactly what we'll see happening. But, as I said, don't forget the competition. The world can change around you. There can be external threats. On the left-hand side, we see some examples that the relevant incumbents didn't see coming. So our industry did for the canals in the 19th century. Nokia, did they see the iPhone coming? I think not. Kodak actually had more patents than anybody else in digital photography. They made two mistakes. First of all, they said the quality isn't good enough. Our customers would much prefer our lovely 35mm Kodachrome, and look at that quality. So they didn't realize how much, or didn't anticipate how much the quality would improve. But that wasn't their real mistake. Their real mistake was not realizing the change in the customer experience, the instantaneousness, if that's a word, of you immediately get your photograph with a digital photograph. You don't have to trot down the chemist and go back again a week later. And that trumps quality. It's a completely different business proposition. On the right-hand side, we can see some things that are coming to a transport industry near us. Well, not just soon, they're here already. So what will BlaBlaCar, that's car sharing effectively, do? That is, I believe, #1 on SNCF's risk register. Uber and Tesla, I probably don't need to explain to you. So don't think we're working in a vacuum. People talk about burning platforms being necessary to stimulate innovation. We potentially have a burning platform. Can rail be part of the transport solution, part of the transport revolution, or will we go the way of the canals? So, thinking now about finding a solution. So you've decided what's the problem you want to solve. You've got your output specification. You then probably want to have some sort of competition because you want to find out who are the best people to respond to this challenge that you've identified. Now, you might think that's radical. You know, that's not how we normally procure things. Well, actually, the railway's been at this rather a long time. It's not new. An original output specification was the Liverpool-Manchester Railway, where they said, well, we know the conventional technology is either horses or rope haulage from steam engines, but we quite fancy the idea of some of these things they've been using on the mining railways, these things called locomotives, but we're not convinced they'll work. It's never been done before on a passenger railway. In fact, we've never done a passenger railway before. So they ran a competition, and the rest is history. I think you know which one won that. Slightly more recently, here is an example of a similar sort of process. Some of you in the audience will know exactly what that is. It's solid-state interlocking, and back in the 80s, British Rail identified that they had a problem. Most of their signaling was based upon relay interlocking, and that was clearly not the future. Very expensive to install, very expensive to maintain, not terribly scalable, relay rooms everywhere. And they'd already got as far in Derby research as having a bench prototype of a solid state alternative to that. But BR didn't make signaling, so they know the thing conceptually works, but how do they get it from their research into a product? Well, what they did was they actually ran a little competition, and they identified 2 suppliers. Back in the day it was GEC and Westinghouse, and they collaborated with them, and they created a commercial arrangement which is a win-win. So the suppliers got a new product, they got a reference case, the initial test sites. BR got a solution to their problem and a cheaper way of re-signaling in the future, cheaper, better, more scalable. And they also, for a period of time until privatization put a spanner in the works, they got royalties on the international sales. And so, there's a win-win. What we'd call these days the infrastructure manager and the supply chain working together to create a new world-beating product. So, if we've done it once, how can we do it again? And some of this is starting to happen. So if I draw the parallel with Derby research, well, that wasn't an open to all comers research capability. If you think about it, that was a single company research program. So if you were a supplier, you couldn't go down and use Derby Research's facilities. What we see now is an increasing emergence of collaborative R&D, and the biggest example is the European Shift to Rail program. And in the UK, through the Rail Supply Group initiatives, we're trying to build on that in the UK. And I think it's the next presentation. You'll hear about the UK Rail Research and Innovation Network. And if that's an interesting topic for you, then you might want to stay on for the next presentation. But why don't things get implemented after research? This is the so-called valley of death conundrum. So you've got a situation where there's a lot of effort in research. Towards the end of the research funding, that tails off. You've maybe got a bench prototype like the SSI example, but you haven't yet got anybody interested in turning it into a product. And actually, there's a lot of resource and effort needs to go in over a period of time before you've got a saleable product, and you can make you can make some money out of it and introduce your new product to the market. And many innovations die in the valley of death. So the question is, how might we bridge it? How could we do an SSI type of scheme today? So that brings me back to what I was saying before. It's not just about technology, it's also potentially from the outset thinking about how we're going to procure the solution. So this is a client, government, or Network Rail, or another major infrastructure manager, if we're talking about digital railway, thinking upfront, how are we going to procure this thing that we want, this thing that isn't yet available? If you're a private company, you're fairly at liberty to decide how you want to take things forward. You're investing your own money, you're taking your own risks. If you're a government body, a public body, you have to follow the procurement rules and the procurement law. And there is a perceived wisdom. It's often said that procurement law hampers, if not stifles, innovation. For all of the risks that I talked about before, it's unproven, there's maybe only one company makes it or whatever. But does it? Now then, apologies for this, I'm not going to read through this, but this just proves that there is some law to help us. This is a direct extract from the EU Public Procurement Directive, and the first 4 are things you've probably heard of. Particularly the first one is probably the one that you see in most procurements these days. You might not have heard of the 5th one, because that's relatively new. That just came into existence in 2014. And that's the Innovation Partnership Procedure. And it's hardly ever been used. But I think it's got great potential. And what is it then? It's what's called a pre-commercial procurement arrangement for public sector. So where we've got a situation where the public sector wants to solve a problem, they have an output specification, for example, but they know that there's nothing on the market. They can't do as they would normally do and go to the market and there'll be, half a dozen companies perfectly able to respond and provide a solution because it's something that's been done before. They're in this situation where they want to solve a tricky problem, but there's nobody on the market making what's needed. So the competition here is not about, I want to buy one of these half a dozen Me Too type products. The competition here is about, I want to work out which organization or consortia I want to work with. So the competition is not to find the product, it's to find the partner to develop the product. So what this does is it combines the solution development and the purchase. What's really significant about this, some of you may have heard of a thing called SBRI, which stands for the Small Business Research Initiative. It should just be called initiative because it's not just for research and it's not just for small businesses, but it's the predecessor version of this thing. But the big difference between SBRI and this is with SBRI, you could get to the point where you developed a prototype, but then you had to go back out to conventional procurement to buy a dozen of them or whatever. With this mechanism, if you wish, you can then buy as many as you want at the end of the process. You can have multiple partners. You might decide, like BR did back in the day, that you don't just want to have GE or Westinghouse, you want both. And they actually decided they wanted to develop a single product, which you could do, or you could decide that you want to develop two alternative products. That you can approach it in a number of ways. And it allows a phased development, so you can go through stage gates. You could spend a little bit of money with quite a number of companies to do some feasibility studies, and then you could down select to a smaller number, take them forward to some simulation, down select again. And you can set out the stage gates as to how you're going to do that. So has it been done? Well, yes, sort of. And in the digital railway world, there is an example. And this used the old SBRI scheme, but it's pretty much the same as the Innovation Partnership approach. COMPASS stands for the Combined Position Alternative Signalling System, and it's a collaboration between the Digital Railway Programme, RSSB, and Network Rail, who are providing the funding to take that forward. And what is it for? Well, it's about degraded mode signalling. So many of you will probably know that signal failure is well, it should be a low frequency, but it's certainly a high impact event. And as many of you will probably know, currently, if the signals go black, there's lots of us out in orange jackets running about to stand at signals, stand at telephones, talk to drivers, talk to signalmen. Now, just in me saying that, you'd probably understand that that might not be the most robust 21st century way of controlling trains. And we have this problem today with conventional colour light signalling. Imagine the situation in the future where we've got all of the signalling in the cab, and for whatever reason, we lose that signalling. Then the signaller has no idea where all the trains are. All the trains out on the network, he just doesn't know where they are. And there's no longer any signals for the guy in the yellow jacket to go and stand at. So how do you get a digital railway back up operating if in that very low probability event it fails? And what this is about is giving the information to the signaller so that he can make much more robust and informed decisions. So this is an alternative system, a relatively inexpensive backup system where we're using secondary systems, GPS systems, etc., in order to reflect in the signal box where the fleet is, so that then the signaller can give movement authorities with much more confidence and hopefully get things back up to running. And of course he can do that much quicker than waiting for people in yellow jackets driving vans to site and getting into position. So that's the problem they're trying to solve. and I've sort of more or less covered that, so I will move on. But it does feeds into both the operational systems, which I've just described, and also potentially into the customer information systems, so we can provide improved information to customers in the event of disruption. So that's what they were trying to do. How have they gone about it? Well, they ran a competition. I think from memory there was it says that 5 suppliers were selected to undertake feasibility studies. They were relatively quick, short pieces of work for the client, relatively inexpensive to test the market with 5 suppliers and get five ideas from five potential products. They took those 5, they down selected them at the end of December 15 into 2, and that was they then took those forward and had basically 12 months setting up lab prototypes and simulating the system. There was then another selection, and just a few months ago they down selected to a single supplier. Now it says in this case, because as I said before, in this case, they chose to get down to a single supplier, but they might equally have said, well, we want 2 in the race at the end. And the beauty of this process is all the options are there for whoever's commissioning it. And right now, the final supplier, which is a company called Altran, are working on developing a demonstrator, which will be demonstrated on 2 Network Rail sites by March 18. So it is being done on the railway. It does work, and if it was, as it were, upgraded to the innovation partnership method, then Network Rail Digital Railway Programme would then be able to go out and buy as many of these systems as they need going forward, on the assumption it works. And the other point here is at any stage you can stop this. So if the prototype, if when you get to the end of the demonstrator, it's sort of half worked, there's no obligation to go on to the next stage. But in partnership, you've developed potentially a new product there. So, what do I think the benefits are? Well, this is a win-win to my mind, a bit like the example I gave with SSI. So for the client, it allows them to test the market, to look at multiple solutions. It de-risks the development, because imagine here you're taking it in stages, in increments. You're taking it through stage gates. You can kill it off if it's not working, and you can modify it at each stage gate. Now compare that to the alternative of trying to buy something that's never been done before, where you run a competition, the suppliers declare that they can deliver it, you have to choose a single supplier. That's high risk for both the supplier and for the client. As I say, it allows requirements to be changed as your knowledge develops through the program. Good budget control, because you can modify it at those stages. And the fundamental point is it's solving what was previously insuperable problem, the thing that's not been done before. For the supplier, it's potentially a route into rail or into a new part of the rail market. It's an opportunity to showcase what you can do. It's helping co-develop your new product. Importantly, the IP that's developed remains with the supplier, so they can take that to market worldwide. There may be a deal about rights that the client has, but the fundamental IP remains with the supplier, and they get a new product. And if you go back to the SSI example, it's very similar. This is the modern version of that approach. It's a collaboration between client and supplier or suppliers. It solves the client's problem, and it gives the supplier a new product. What's not to like about that? And I float the thought that if we see greater benefits in ETCS level 3, effectively moving block signaling, than we do in ETCS level 2, and there's an intent in the industry to have a parallel development process. While we're starting to install ETCS level 2, we're going to be developing ETCS level 3 alongside. Well, why not use this model? So I'm very pleased to take any questions. So Chris with his... So Chris has his roving mic. Mr. Kendall, would you say who I know who you are, but would you say for the benefit of everybody else who you are and what your question is, Tim?
Yeah, I'm Tim Kendall, a long-term railway civil engineer, recently working at the department, but now completely independent of them, and I do not represent them in any way whatsoever, but working in light rail. You talk about innovation, so that's absolutely wonderful to see this coming along, but it is virtually impossible to get existing proven technology that isn't on Network Rail's approved list to actually be implemented where it could be cheaper and just right for your innovation. And one thing I'm particularly thinking of is tramway-style electrification for the tram train trial up in Sheffield. There's no need for that heavy electrification that they're putting in, where the tramway style can be well clear of existing running stock, so no issue there, and about half, if not a quarter of the price. How can we actually get new innovation and old innovation, which is gives a cost advantage in?
Okay. No, really good question, and I know it's product acceptance, not just from Network Rail, but with other clients as well, is a perennial concern and issue for the supply chain. It regularly comes up to us from members. We've, to be fair to Network Rail in particular, they're very conscious of this and recently initiated an improvement program around their product acceptance processes, and the range of initiatives, and they plan to do more. So, for instance, now one of the previous complaints was it's gone into we've submitted our proposal and it's gone into a black hole. We don't know where it is. If you go on their website now, you'll find every 2 weeks they publish a list of where all of the product approval requests are in the pipeline. So there's an example of a step in the right direction. Another thing that they're doing is they're conscious that one of the hold-ups has been the amount of internal resource that they're doing. So in the world of plant acceptance, they've just decided to outsource that engineering support so that they can accelerate. So they are aware. At the other side of the equation, and it was mentioned yesterday in one of the other presentations, Network Rail are putting out there what they call their challenge statements. And again, on the website, there's a whole list of things that they're trying to resolve, and they're actively encouraging suppliers to look at those and and propose solutions. So I think the acid test there is when people come forward with solutions, can they get it through a slick product acceptance process to get it into delivery. But as the Railway Industry Association, we're constantly engaged with both TfL and Network Rail to encourage them to hone and improve their product acceptance processes. Okay, another question, perhaps? Over here.
Just one quick one, really. My name is Vijay, and I represent Avion Systems Consulting. We are a 3-year-old firm. We are solely dedicated to the railways industry now. And the few examples of innovation that you put in there, you must realize that they come from very small, nimble, agile, 2 people, 3 people companies.
Yeah.
I find railways more geared towards bigger people like Altran and Atkins, and innovation is their forte, really. We come up with newer ideas. Is there any channel for us to explore and perhaps develop these ideas into products?
Yes, and Simon Ravitsky in the next presentation will be talking about the UK Rail Research and Innovation Network, which I mentioned before, which is, whilst it's effectively sponsored by some of the bigger companies now, it's absolutely intended to be an incubator development environment for SMEs. And we, the RIA and the RSG, have been looking at what other sectors are doing to stimulate the SMEs into the rail market. And we know that most job creation and most innovation comes from SMEs. So there's we're at the foothills, really, of a number of programs to try and address that. So You will hear, for example, later on in the program, there'll be Guy Woodruff from RSSB talking about the rail technical strategy. So that's setting out the direction of travel and the challenges. And we are seeking as an industry some funding in CP6 to pump prime innovation. And we're trying to create the environment to do the innovation through the Ukraine network. Now, put all that infrastructure into place and that funding. It's very similar to what we've seen happen successfully in aerospace, automotive, and other sectors to help get the smaller companies involved. So it's early days yet, but watch this space. Yeah. Okay, another question. Okay.
Hi, Ben Evans from Atkins. Just going back to, you put a slide up earlier and talked about competition and put up the likes of Uber. I just wondered, should we be thinking more about collaboration and integration than competition?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry if I didn't emphasize that. I think I talked about somewhere about it being a collaborative win-win. I mean, there has to be I think what is the potential of the model I've talked about, the innovation partnerships, is it's very much about collaboration between client and supplier. And the supply end of that equation could be a consortia, very often is. And that's another way that smaller companies can be brought in. So there's that element of collaboration. And you saw that happening effectively. There's a commercial collaborative arrangement, a bit like SSI in the day, but at some point there has to be some kind of selection process. Who do I want to collaborate with? So the competition is right up front. It's choosing the people you want to collaborate with, and then the process thereafter is collaborative. Another thing that we've recommended Digital Railway Programme look at, and they're actually going to go and visit this and really have a look at it, is a thing called Nightworks, which is a Ministry of Defence scheme. Which is absolutely about collaboration, and how it essentially works is you become a member as a supplier of the Nightworks fraternity, if you like, and when the MOD have a tricky problem that they don't know how to solve, then they get everybody in the room that wants to come into the room, say, here's our problem, let's discuss, and whoever comes into the room, the IP that they come into the room with, they own. So their background IP they own. Whatever solution they come out with, there's then a bespoke deal about the ownership of the IP for that solution. So Digital Railway are actively going to look at that. And I could talk about a number of other models, but a key word in all of them, you're absolutely right, is collaboration.